it is our custom to ask one of our honored guests to speak on behalf of our medalists. This year, we will have the pleasure of hearing Wendy Young.
They warned me this is heavy, and they weren't kidding. Thank you, President Falk, students, faculty, alumni, friends, and family. I stand before you humbled to be here. To be part of this tremendous group of medalists is such a huge honor and a testament to the intellectual power, the creative energy, and the sheer smarts that come from this small but mighty college. I've always been struck by how Williams students, faculty, and alumni feel like family when I have the opportunity to connect or reconnect. 35 years ago, I sat exactly where you sit today, although with a lot fewer wrinkles than I have now. And by the way, I'm convinced I'm still 20 years old, so feel somewhat intimidated by the idea that I might impart any sage advice that you can take with you. But here it goes, I'm going to do my best. At Kind, I work with children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers who have had few choices in life. Most have been raised in abject poverty under repressive governments, subject to human trafficking, sexual and gender-based violence, abduction, torture, human rights abuses, and often witness to the murder of friends and family. Simply put, they have been denied their childhood. Most come from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, all three of which rank among the top murder capitals of the world, with El Salvador consistently ranking first. Transnational gangs and narco cartels dominate their societies, systematically taking over communities to terrorize and exploit them because governments are too weak or corrupt to intervene. The rule of law is broken, and these countries are teetering on the edge of complete failure. At age 17, Ingrid was walking home from a trip to the store when she was kidnapped and dragged into a car by gang members. She was drugged and gang raped until her family paid a ransom of $3,000. Her kidnappers were never arrested, and her family continued to receive threats that she would be abducted again until she finally fled for the United States. Families such as Ingrid's are making the extraordinarily difficult decision to send their children out into the world on their own in the desperate hope that they will find safety in the United States. As one mother said, "I would rather my child die on the journey to the United States than on my doorstep." They are doing what refugees around the world do when no other options are available. They are making the selfless decision to perhaps never see their children again in order to save their lives. Which brings me back to choices. These families' lack of choice, their desperation, presents the United States and we as individual citizens with choices. Who do we want to be? What do we want to stand for? Are we going to choose a country that limits its stature in the world by turning its back on those in need? Or are we going to embrace our long-standing and hard-won reputation as a country that stands up for human rights, freedom, and democracy? Here's a microcosm of what I mean. I met Maria in immigration court. The judge sat in his robes behind the bench when he called her deportation case. A trial attorney from the Department of Homeland Security sat at the front, prepared to argue for Maria's removal from the US. Maria was by herself without a lawyer by her side. She was 5 years old. She approached the bench wearing her little Sunday best, clutching a doll. She sat behind the respondent's desk, barely able to see over the microphone. The judge asked her a number of questions about why she was in the United States and about her life here, none of which she could answer. Her eyes grew bigger and bigger as she sat silently, until he finally dismissed her and told her to come back at a later date. As she left the court, he asked her what the name of her doll was. In Spanish, she replied, "Baby, baby doll." That was the only question she could answer. That moment haunts me. I continually wonder about how the world's democratic leader, grounded in principles of justice and due process, can tolerate the inhumanity of asking a 5-year-old to stand alone and defend herself against deportation in a federal courtroom. And beyond that, even though I have spent the past 3 decades since my graduation from Williams fighting for refugee protection and immigrant rights, such questions, which include immigration policy, extend far beyond the immigration debate and are truly becoming existential for this country and indeed the entire world. The degradation and decay of our love and respect for each other is palpable. Racial divide, gender inequality, hostility towards those who worship a different God or want to marry and love someone in a non-traditional relationship are spreading like a pervasive cancer. It's become acceptable to mock people with disabilities. An entire nation has been painted as rapists. Judges are deemed biased because of their ethnicity. Women are belittled and people brag about grabbing them inappropriately, and that is dismissed as locker room talk. Elected officials are exploiting these divisions, empowering themselves by stirring up the toxicity of us versus them. And we as a society are too often pivoting to defining ourselves and each other by our differences, as if those differences are the most critical feature of our lives, rather than recognizing our commonality as humans. So back to those choices I mentioned. We can turn this around. We can challenge ourselves to strive for that most perfect union that shaped a vision for our country and set a standard for the world. Our history is replete with people who made the simple choice to look beyond themselves and stand up for what's right. Some names are, of course, instantly recognizable. Abraham Lincoln, who simply but profoundly stated, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." Martin Luther King, who fiercely believed that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. John F. Kennedy, who reminded us that things do not happen, they are made to happen. Others who stood up did so in the course of everyday life. A woman who chose not to sit at the back of the bus simply because of the color of her skin. A Chinese student who blocked a line of tanks on Tiananmen Square, his identity still unknown. A working-class couple who refused to leave the state of Virginia just because of the biracial nature of their marriage, and that was considered illegal. A young woman who stood up this summer against racism and anti-Semitism and was run over by a car in a fit of bigoted rage in a peaceful college town in central Virginia. And still others who remain nameless but engage in daily acts of kindness, such as the thousands of private sector lawyers who volunteer their time with kind to represent children in court. Both Ingrid and Maria were granted protection and allowed to remain in the U.S. simply because a lawyer volunteered their time. When I asked my staff what it took for our volunteers to represent a 5-year-old, she answered a lot of Play-Doh and a lot of candy. It also took dedication, empathy, and commitment. As you round the corner to graduation, I would ask you to embrace your choices and stand up for what's right. Let's reject us versus them thinking and instead embrace we, the people. We can be in charge of our destiny. We can change the world for the better. It's been done before, and there's no reason to give up and say that we can't do it again. I hope you will bear with me as I'm going to end on a very personal note. 4 weeks ago, my husband died unexpectedly at age 54. He had immigrated to the U.S. from Colombia as a young child. He became a U.S. citizen in his mid-20s. He spent the bulk of his career in government working for the Department of Justice, trying to advance positive change in the hardest way possible, from the inside. He never gave up on the institution of government and firmly believed that it could stand for its citizenry and better people's lives. He never judged others, but he was distressed by what he felt was a polarization in our society. He hated the viciousness and bigotry that led to that terrible turmoil in Charlottesville the weekend before he died, a town to which we had planned to eventually retire, in part because of his great sense of inclusion. Simply put, he lived his values, the values that can bring us together: love of family, the bonds of friendship, respect for the other, a sense of community and country while never forgetting the larger world. I keenly miss him, but even in loss, there are precious moments through which I have been reminded of the profoundness of human compassion. 2 faces come to mind, 2 faces for which I will never have names. When I rushed to the hospital after receiving the call that my husband had collapsed and they were unable to find a pulse, I was frantic as I tried to find him, still hoping that they'd been able to revive him. When I was told to wait, one moment more unbearable than the next. Two strangers came up to me. Each took a hand and held it. One was a policewoman in uniform, the other a middle-aged woman wearing a hijab. They told me everything would be okay. I wish I knew their names, but maybe that doesn't matter. Selfless acts of love stand on their own. No names are needed. All of us can commit those acts. As you leave this beautiful, idyllic campus and set forth into the world, I hope you will embrace your choices. If we all choose humanity, if we step outside ourselves and show compassion and understanding for the stranger standing next to us, I'm confident that we will turn the corner away from the darkness and into the light. We will find our way back to a place where immigrants and refugees are welcome, where children can dream of an education and put behind them the nightmare of conflict and human rights abuses, where health care is a right shared by all and not just a privilege for those who can afford it, where a young man raised by a white mother and a black father can become president, and a woman is not judged by her age, hairstyle, and clothing, but is assumed perfectly capable of becoming his successor, where the simple act of holding the hand of a new widow once again becomes who we are. All of you have those choices. Thank you.